We're ready to get started here. Thank you all for coming. I hope you can hear me all right. I got a cold, so my voice is a little bit gone. So I would like to introduce myself. I am Sasha Rosenbaum. I am on the Azure DevOps team. I'm a program manager. And I'm going to talk about deploying apps to Kubernetes using CI/CD in 20 minutes. And this is about my only slide. So I'm really hoping my demo works, because that's all I have for you today. So who here is deploying applications to Kubernetes? OK. Who here is thinking about deploying applications to Kubernetes? OK. And if you didn't raise your hand, you're probably in the wrong session. So all right, let's go into the demo. So what we are going to talk about today is how you can deploy to Kubernetes using Azure Pipelines. Is there anyone here who is not familiar with Azure DevOps at all? OK, a couple folks. So Azure DevOps is a SaaS-based tool on Azure that lets you manage all the steps of your application lifecycle, including the CI/CD pipelines. And one of the things that we're doing a lot right now is we're using YAML pipelines. YAML pipelines are cool because instead of defining your pipeline in the UI, you can actually define it in code, and you can check it into source control, and you can keep track of the versioning together with your pipeline. So I have a couple of pipelines here, and the first thing I'm going to start with is the pipeline that actually deploys my cluster. So I'm going to kick it off because it's going to take a little bit to run. And that's where we're hoping that the internet's going to work. So while it's running, I'm going to show you what's actually in there. So this happens to be a GitHub repository, OK? And it's really, really simple. We just have a few files in there. So in this case, I'm using Terraform to define my resource group and my AKS cluster. And so you can see those files are really, really simple. And then the second thing I have in here is a YAML pipeline that actually deploys this. So it has just a couple of steps, and I'm running Terraform init. I'm running Terraform plan. And then in the second stage, I'm also running Terraform apply, so that actually goes and deploys this stuff. Now, I could obviously do this with ARM templates and multiple other technologies. This is just an example of how you can do this in code. And then let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see this. And then the other thing that I want to mention here is that I'm defining a lot of things in variables. And so some of them are in the pipeline, and some of them are actually in Azure Pipelines in secrets. And they can also be in Azure Key Vault. And that's the way I can put this on GitHub in an open source, but I am not actually sharing my secrets with you. Right? So I can go back into my resource groups. I already have a cluster that I deployed using this pipeline. And so once this pipeline actually runs, I'm going to have another one. And the only thing I've changed is a little bit of code and a prefix. So this is going to deploy another one with a -2. OK? So let's see what's happening with our pipelines here. So we can see that the init and plan, the first stage, actually ran. But then now I can go into my second stage, and I can see that it's actually waiting for an approval. So this is something that we introduced relatively recently in YAML pipelines. It existed in Classic, but now you can also approve stuff in YAML. So I can define my approvers. In this case, I'm approving myself. Usually, that's not a good idea. You want at least 2 people to look at your stuff before you push it into production. So now this is going, and it's going to deploy the cluster. We can actually talk about deploying an application. So I'm going to go back into my pipelines, and I'm actually going to just start a new pipeline. So again, we're talking about deploying apps in 20 minutes. So I can just start from a new experience. And I pick a GitHub repository as a source. I can also pick multiple other places to start from. All right, my internet is actually better than it was this morning, so that's good news. So then, because I have a Docker file in my repository, Azure Pipelines actually automatically detects that it's a Docker container And so this can be deployed in a couple of places where we run containers, including AKS. So what I just did there, I selected my Azure subscription, and then I'm going to select a cluster. Obviously, I have too many clusters because Kubernetes is really cool and everyone wants to deploy to there. So I'm going to give it a new namespace name. I'm going to pick my container registry by scrolling a lot. And then I'm going to do something called Enable Review App for pull requests. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that one. So I'm going to say validate and configure. And again, this generates a starter YAML pipeline for me to deploy my application into Kubernetes. So if I know nothing about YAML pipelines and I know nothing about how to deploy into AKS, I could just do this with just the default settings from here. Okay, so we can see multiple things, and this is kind of hard to see, and maybe I don't want to spend a lot of time walking you through all of these things. But we can see that it's triggering on master, so that means every time I push something into this repository, it's going to kick it off. And then it checks out the repo. Again, I have some variables defined by default. And then it has a couple stages. It has a build stage in which it's going to build and push the Docker container into my container registry, right, that I just selected. And then it's going to also deploy. So there's a deploy job, which I can find. Okay, and then there's another thing that says deploy and pull requests, which again, we're going to talk about a little bit more later. So I'm just going to check it in. So basically, what this does is it creates an Azure Pipelines YAML file with this pipeline. And it also creates the manifest files, which have some definitions about how this app is going to actually run on Kubernetes. So again, this is just making it simple for everybody who wants to do this. Okay, so this started the build stage. I'm just going to show you that we have these live logs, and it's going to pick up an agent and start running. Our agents are fully cloud-based, and we have different types of agents. So you can run on Windows, on Linux, on Mac OS. So this is very neat and useful. Okay, so it started building, and while it's doing this, let us check on the status of our other pipelines, see how it's going. Okay, this one's still going, and the simple go up is still going. Okay, so we can now talk about what we said about the review app. So when you deploy new applications, usually if you're using Git, you're familiar with the concept of pull requests, and pull requests are very, very useful because then I can review my code after I've written it. Some other people can take a look at it. I can also trigger pipelines with some tests, right? So I have this flow that allows me to make sure that my code is good before I push it to production. But then there's another thing that happens a lot with microservices, which is I would like to test my service after I've committed a pull request and before it actually goes and breaks something for everybody else on my cluster, right? So that's kind of a big problem for a lot of our customers, and we've been trying to solve this. So what we're doing with this right now is that we did something called Review App, and I'm going to show you real quickly. So this is just another simple application. All my applications are basically hello world, and they're just running in this Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to create a new branch on here. So I'm going to give it a very meaningful name. Okay, so this is just a GitHub repo with a simple application that is deployed by my pipeline. Okay, and then I'm going to make a change. Type in is hard. Okay, so I just committed my changes. And then I'm actually going to create a pull request on this. So I'm going to compare and pull request on this branch. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm actually pull requesting to the right repo. Okay. So I just created a pull request. Okay. So this is actually just going through the process. But what happened here, actually, And I'm going to go into other pipelines. Okay, so what just happened here is this is the application, right? It's the pipelines JavaScript Docker. And it kicked off a build. And I'm afraid it's going to take it a minute, so I'm going to show you one that already ran. So I'm going to go into one that already ran. And you can notice, I don't know if you can see it really good, but you can see that there are different types of triggers. So one is individual CI, which means I kicked it off on master. And the other ones are the PRs. So it kicks off on a PR automatically. So if I go into one that actually kicked off on a PR, and I go into the deploy stage, I can see that instead of this first deploy, which actually executes when I commit to master, instead I'm executing a different thing. I'm executing the deploy PR sequence. And so basically what happens is the review app gets activated, and then I'm actually going and I'm creating a new namespace on Kubernetes to match my branch. So for every branch that I created that I pull requested, I'm actually going and creating a new namespace, and instead of deploying my application into my cluster, into production environment, I just did a standalone deploy. And so you can now test your changes really easily. And then if I did merge that PR into my application, actually, it would it would actually kick off the actual production deploy, and it would go into production. So you can see that I now have different deployments in here, and for each branch, I actually have a standalone namespace with my application in there. So let's check how the other pipelines are doing. Okay, so it's still running, so you will have to, so the Terraform deployment is still running, so you will have to believe me that it actually deployed. But so here, if I come into here, I can see basically that my application has deployed. And the other thing that we have in here is the concept called environments. So I can go into view environment for my service, and I can click on the deployment that I had, and I can go into services. So this is something that's very, very useful. It used to be kind of hard to find out where your application actually deployed, and then you had to go and explore your cluster and figure out what the IP was and stuff like that. So I can actually see we're now bringing all of these details here. And so you actually have the information out here. So if I go here, I can see that Azure DevOps actually rocks. So let's see if I'm lucky enough for this pipeline to complete. Nope, so I can't show you that it actually deployed a cluster. But it would just basically deploy a Kubernetes cluster, which you can deploy your changes to. All right. And I have lots of time left now, so I have to make up new things to tell you. So let's think about what other features I could tell you about existence. So I could also tell you about something that's called Canary release deployments. Okay. So if I go into this pipeline, actually went too far. Okay, so if I go into this pipeline, by the way, this is something that I mentioned before, that we have a VM image that we're running, and so basically I just get to define which image you're running on. And then the other thing is, if you're super not familiar with YAML, you can see that we are generating the task here from Classic. So if you know how the task looks in Classic, you can actually bring it into your pipeline over there. So if I do this here, and I will find the right place where my Canary actually is. So what I'm doing here is a rollout strategy that's called Canary. And what it's doing, it is working in increments of 25 and 50. And then I also have something that's defined that's called delay for minutes. Okay? So what will happen here when I click off this pipeline, instead of pushing your application directly into prod, it will actually roll it out in stages. And it will just continue rolling it out in the increments that I specified for the minutes that I specified. Now, you don't monitor that deployment by going to the actual deployment and looking at it. You actually monitor it by monitoring the actual app that's running. So you have to be careful about logging stuff and making sure that it works. But this allows you to actually see that your application's working before it gets rolled out into production. And then there's another thing in here that I can't show you really quickly, but it basically deploys, or maybe I can. Let's see. So basically, when it deploys the, and this is a production deployment, but anyway, when it deploys the Canary rollouts, instead of just going all into production and just doing one Canary, it actually deploys the baseline and the Canary. So it will have another replica of your production application right now, and it will have a Canary replica running in a single pod. So you have, like, say, 4 pods for production, and then you have a baseline and a Canary, so you can actually compare these pods. So because your existing pods might be running for a long time, or they might be scaled out differently, so you're not comparing apples to apples, but with the Canary rollout, you can actually do that. Okay. Let's see if my pipelines have deployed. Okay, so that has completed successfully. So if I refresh it in here, we can see that we actually got a new cluster. So yes. Okay. Okay, who has questions? Because I have 3 minutes. Yes. I can maybe give you a mic. Okay.
Just quickly on the Canary deployments, just a bit of an understanding that you said don't look at the deployment itself.
I can barely hear you.
You stated that do not look at the deployment itself when you're doing a Canary deployment.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand why is there a difference between, you're creating another replica set, you said, right?
Yes.
For the Canary, and then you're leaking traffic to that replica set?
Yes.
Okay.
But the traffic is routed sort of in a round-robin way, right? So when you go to that, like if you go into that, your end user won't be able to tell which application it's actually going to, which version, right? So what you need to do is actually monitor on the application side. So that's like the official definition of Canary deployments. There's also something called blue-green deployments, which is different, which means I'm routing traffic to different things. And this is also something we're going to roll out now or shortly, but this is not something I'm doing right here.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, okay.
Like, how do you do a rollback deployment using a pipeline?
Rollback up. So basically, you would have to go to your previous version and just push that version.
Like, are you guys using Helm deploy?
So you can use Helm in here. I'm not using Helm right now, but you can absolutely define Helm definitions.
Okay,
yes.
good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, what's the max delay you can use on that feature?
I don't know the answer to this question, but you can have as long as you want, I assume. One more minute. One last question. All right. Well, I hope you enjoy this, and see you all using the pipelines.